Hey, how's it going? I'm going to be going over some tips and tricks for doing an alternator on a 94 to, I believe, an '01 Integra. So I have the alternator out right now, and I'll kind of talk about the process that I did to do this. As you can see, I did not remove the wheel, I have not jacked up the car, and there's a couple of tricks to go about doing this. So of course on these cars, the alternator is in the back of the engine in a really annoying spot to get to, and there's a couple of things that you can remove and kind of get out of the way that will allow you to kind of Tetris the alternator out of there. First thing I recommend doing is removing this powered steering line. You actually don't have to remove the line, you just have to disconnect it on this end. You don't have to worry about disconnecting on that end. On these cars, of course, this line is going to be a little old and brittle, so just be a little bit careful with that. But to remove it, all you have to do is remove these two bolts. There's no gasket or anything, so it just pulls straight up. I recommend having a bag nearby so that you can catch all the fluid that's going to leak out into the bag. Also then have an oil kind of catcher underneath the car, or some sort of bucket if you have the space to actually do it, if you lifted up the car, for instance. And this is going to seep very slowly during the course of you doing the alternator. So if you have to go and wait for your alternator to come in, you just want to remove it, you might want to put it on. So the alternator connects onto this bracket right here, which is held in kind of like that with two bolts. These bolts are directly into the block, so they're going to be a little bit annoying to remove. You just got to be a little bit careful and make sure that they're not being rounded at all. In this case, I'm pretty good on these. They were a little hard to break, so I did need to use a pry bar. Just apply, pressure, slowly until they start to break and get loose. The alternator is held in at the bottom with this pin here. So you undo this bolt and then you pull out this pin. I recommend using some sort of pry bar, anything, and then a mallet to kind of tap it out once you get the bolt undone, or the nut undone. And then so the alternator is held in by two bolts, one on the top and one on the bottom. The top one is pretty easy to get out, and the bottom one's going to be a little bit annoying. That's why most people recommend removing this wheel or turning it so that you can get access to it from the bottom. You don't actually need that, but you might need it if your alternator is stuck on. However, you can typically put the belt to the side. I don't know if you can see that, but I have the belt taken off. So how I did that is I, took the belt and I twisted it. Obviously this was when I had the bracket out, so there was no tension on it. I twisted the belt and I was able to get around between, the strut and the alternator, and I was able to get the belt off. That allowed me to get access to the nut. However, if your car, hasn't had the alternator off in a while, it's going to be probably stuck on there a little bit, so you might want to remove the wheel. Finally, there's two methods to get the alternator off, actually, which is like, even when you're pulling it out straight up through the top, there's actually two ways to go about it. I like to rotate it this way so that the brown connector is facing the strut wall. And then I think it is better to have it more this way versus this way. You can get it out if you have the pieces that extrude out into between the strut and the engine. That is fine, but it is a little bit more easier if you do it this way, and you kind of have that little part that extrudes out over here more. And then you have to kind of like wiggle it this way, and then it goes out. It's a little bit easier if you have two people, so one person can catch it, as you kind of like need to reposition your hand, but it's not too bad. Finally, getting it in is much easier than getting it out, of course. So I don't have really any tricks for that. I do recommend, as you can see I'm doing this for the second time, I do recommend not using a AutoZone alternator, or if you do, O'Reilly's or AutoZone, have them test it before you put it in, because we got a faulty one. It worked for around 30 seconds. I had, 14 volts on the battery, which was perfect, but then of course, after around 10 minutes, the alternator was giving me, 1.2 volts. And then when I took it out and when I got it tested, it was giving me 0.6. So I warranted it out, and I'm going to go with that one. But I looked online everywhere, and there's not any original Denso, like old new stocks for sale. So you're kind of stuck with the remanufactured ones, and AutoZone and O'Reilly's and Napa, they seem to be questionable. So always have them test them before you, put them in. Finally, of course, since you're working with the alternator, you want to take off the positive terminal. Don't take off just the negative one. You want to take off the positive one as well. If you're a little concerned about rats, chewing up the wires between the alternator and the battery, and that's why you're not getting power, you can run a multimeter and check if they have connections. You can also do it the old-fashioned way, just take off the connector and tap it against your subframe and see if it sparks. But that's why you always got to remove the battery.